All right. So I wanted to go ahead and record this because we're not really going to have time to do much talking about the revisions or the essays until, well, really until period, because you will be taking your midterm. Grades were generally kind of low. I wasn't super thrilled with it. My biggest frustration was that it seemed like many of you didn't quite grasp the notion of a 5 paragraph essay. Um, or if you did, you didn't quite grasp the notion of true development. And I get it. Writing for history is different than writing for English. It certainly feels more intimidating. It's really not. And so I wanted to give you a few tips. If you'll notice, if you go to where, if you look at your grade, you should be able to view the rubric, and it should pull up and you should see how I scored you as well as see the comments that I made. And I really tried to make some extensive comments. Well, I say extensive. Sometimes it's just a list of like questions of like things you left off, or it's an observation, or that kind of thing. But I tried to kind of steer you in a direction of what was missing or what the problems were. So take a look at that, and kind of look at it. Um, I think the biggest concern is that many of you didn't recognize that within each essay is an inherent structure. One of the pieces of the rubric for this has to do with basically organization, having a thesis sentence, having an intro, having a conclusion, having defined paragraphs, having paragraphs that make sense, that flow, that have a structure within them, right? And so this is middle school type writing stuff right there, and that was a portion of the rubric. So if you had just simply followed good standard essay writing, you would have gotten points, right? As far as usage, like sentence structure, fluency, like how do your sentences sound? Are they short and very abrupt? Do they have some flow to them? Do you have good vocabulary? Do you spell correctly? Do you punctuate correctly? Do you capitalize correctly? Do all those kinds of things. So 2 parts of half of that rubric were basic kind of writing things. And I get it. It was a little bit challenging because it was timed writing. But guys, this is what college is, right? This is what an essay is going to be. And so, you have to learn to be able to edit that stuff as you're going. And you can't always take days and days and days to write something and then revise it. You have to sometimes do this quickly. So you need to go back and take a look at that. The next, what I'm going to do is this writing needs to be put into your Sunnyvale digital portfolio. So you will have an opportunity to basically go to the original, and you will basically create a journal entry, or you'll go to your original, of the draft, and then you'll basically kind of like make a revision to it, or you'll make another draft of it, and you'll kind of correct what you can. And then after you've made the corrections, and I want you to copy it, and then I want you to paste it into your Sunnyvale digital portfolio. And I left instructions on the email. Basically, you go to your Google Drive shared with me, you look for the folder that has your name and your student ID. You open that, you go to cross-curricular social studies, and you paste that text in there. So should all be kind of pretty straightforward. You're not having to recreate the wheel. You're just having to make some corrections. If you make corrections, I'll give you another 5 points. And if you put it in the Sunnyvale digital portfolio, I'll give you another 5 points. So you can earn up to 10 more points. This should pretty much help everybody. And I feel like that's fair. I have a few people that did really well, that did it right the first time. Matter of fact, I had roughly, maybe not quite 10% of you, but probably about 5 of you that did a pretty solid job. Those people, it's a little unfair to them because they don't I mean, they're already either at 40 or 38 points or something like that. So they're not going to get that kind of boost of a full 10 points, but it will help the rest of you, especially those of you who really didn't do very well. And so, of course, you want to be sure you look at that. The other thing I want to point out, when you look at essay prompts, look for the inherent structure. And I had a handful of people come talk to me about it, and I gave them this advice. If you look at prompt number 1, it's asking you a basic question about politics, and you can organize this. Basically, your thesis is there, right? You could say something along the lines of, that the two major political parties were strongly influenced by regarding the issues of corruption, social issues, and the economy, primarily by third parties, right? And you could create kind of a thesis about that. You wanted to have looked at corruption, social issues, and the economy. And as you're doing that, you can either focus in on basically a 3x3 kind of essay where you have Democrats, Republicans, third parties with the corruption, social issues, and the economy, or you could have perhaps done a 3x2 or a 2x3 where you had corruption, social issues, and the economy, with Democrats and Republicans kind of filtering in both of those, the impact of third parties. So that was the structure that was inherent there. That should have guided you. You should have been talking about major political issues. You should have talked about progressives and populists. You should have talked about the issue of stalemate, Republicans being in charge, big business, the idea of the 15th Amendment, the 19th Amendment, those kinds of things, okay? The second prompt talked about the changing roles of minorities. This was an easier prompt. The first one was probably the hardest, and I had a few of you tackle that one, and that would have not been my best advice. The second one was a pretty simple one. Basically, you're looking at women, Blacks, and immigrants and how they impacted the economy, society, and how were reactions against them. So simply, you would have done this as a three-body paragraph essay with women, Blacks, and immigrants talking about how they impacted the economy and society, as well as different groups that reacted against them. Obviously, if you're talking about economics with women, you're talking about women working in the factories. I had a lot of people talking about women being housewives and like as though they had not been working in factories. Remember back to the Lowell mills, right? Women had always been working in factories. Now, it just wasn't, it was for a particular class of woman. And the big change is that what you see emerging is this growing middle class where women don't have to work in factories as much. But you still have very active women that try to reform society. So you needed to touch on the factory work, some of the wage differentials, the lack of respect. You needed to touch on the reform movements from the middle class. You needed to, talk. I had some people do a good job talking about the settlement houses. That was a good extension. You want to talk about how women start to improve their education. And as they start to do this, they start to become very concerned about having the right to vote. Some of you did catch on that women were not happy that Blacks had gotten the right to vote before they did. And so I think that was a very important role. It was also good to talk about the role of women in World War I and how they changed. They took over the jobs when the men were gone. They actually served, as an auxiliary corps. And this is part of what builds momentum for the 19th Amendment. You're also going to see that in the 1920s, you have the new woman emerging, the flappers and that kind of thing. You're going to see that for women, one of the big kind of people that big groups that oppose them, and some of you touched on the KKK, and that's not incorrect, but more broadly, you have the concept of fundamentalism, and that the new women are kind of a depiction of what modern society is coming to. With Blacks, you're talking about the sharecropping kind of issue. Some of you kind of wandered way off back before 1865. So you had the sharecropping issue and kind of the frustration, but you also needed to talk about Plessy v. Ferguson and segregation and the KKK, which of course is the main group that opposes them, and then the kind of pressure, to control their behavior and the frustration that's felt there, the disfranchisement that's going on, and how that as jobs begin to open up north, especially as the U.S. is getting geared up for World War I, you start to have this great migration. And as Black blacks start to move up north and they create these neighborhoods, you start to have the development of the Harlem Renaissance and the artistic and cultural influence of the Harlem Renaissance. A few of you did grasp into the Black nationalism, and that was really good, because that is certainly a part of it. Being proud of being Black as a part of the Harlem Renaissance. With immigrants, you needed to have talked about kind of the push-pull factors. You needed to talk about the development of tenements and poor neighborhoods. You could have, and I didn't really count off if you didn't, talked about city politics and the kind of the ward bosses and that kind of thing. You should have talked about the low wage labor and how they created the steady supply of workers and consumers. The impact of ethnic neighborhoods, not only on political issues, but also on city development, and of course, the emerging nativist reaction. You should have included in that something about Asian immigration, particularly Chinese immigration, and how it affected California, especially when we get to the Chinese Exclusion Act. But you also have immigration quotas in the 1920s, the concerns about unions, and the Red Scare, right? And so those were things that you should have kind of touched on. With prompt number 2. Prompt number 3 was the easiest prompt. This is a straightforward 3-part. There's not a 3x3 or 2x3 or all this other kind of stuff that I'm talking about. What you have here is industrialization and how society, the economy, and global influence was changed. If you're talking about society, you're talking about social classes and the different social classes. You're talking about urbanization and internal migration as well as immigration, but only in kind of the broad sense. Yes, you would talk about tenements and poverty. You would talk about the middle class wanting to reform and fix things. This would be a good place for someone to interject something about Jacob Riis or the Meat Inspection Act or something like that. And you would have mentioned those concepts. You could have ultimately extended that out into the ultimate impact being the impact of, or the ultimate outcome being the impact of the automobile and changing society and making things very different there. And some people touched on transportation, but they didn't fully develop it as much. The next part would have been the economy. You should have grasped capitalism, the big business angle, the stocks, the horizontal and vertical integration, the huge amounts of money that were flowing through businesses and how that created production efficiency and that lowered wages. And then you have this crisis where you have low wage workers, but can they afford to buy the products? And so you have that notion. Nobody mentioned welfare capitalism. Well, I take it back. I think there were 1 or 2 people that mentioned that Henry Ford paid more, but I don't think they used the term welfare capitalism. And so you should have kind of touched on that. And then when you're talking about the economy, you could have talked about tariffs. You could have talked about banking regulation. You should have talked about to what extent the government started to get involved, trying to control economic issues. The Federal Reserve, that kind of thing. You should have talked about debt cycles, especially as we start to propel the consumption of all this mass-produced stuff with, installment plans and that kind of thing. And many people kind of attributed that just to the 1920s. And remember, you have advertising and catalogs that emerge earlier in the Gilded Age. And all of that's facilitated by the transportation and all that kind of stuff. So that should have been the connection with the economy. Global influence, that was all about imperialism. And some of you got that, or many of you got that, but you didn't really develop the idea. You touched on, markets and trade and raw materials. But what specifically? Like Hawaii, Cuba, the Philippines, Spanish-American War, dollar diplomacy, the Roosevelt Corollary, the Panama Canal, the open door policy. There's lots of policies very specific to global influence. Some people went ahead and talked a little bit about World War I, but understand that part of what sucks us into World War I is going to be the fact that we're producing so much stuff. And this is causing us to trade with Britain and France. And so we're going to have kind of a vested interest in their success. Now, obviously, Germany does other things to make us upset, but you've got to look at kind of that broader concept with the trade and the imperialism and how those things suck us into that. And so these are kind of the ideas that you should have done, should have messed with, depending on which prompt. And people should have looked for those structures inherent in the prompt, and always, always, always do that. Some of you kind of wandered in the wilderness a little bit, and I could tell you knew some stuff, but you didn't necessarily express it clearly. A few of you really need to go back. You need to reevaluate how you expressed your ideas. Some of you, it was very difficult to figure out what you were talking about exactly. And again, remember, half of this rubric had specifically to do with how did you structure how did you structure it? Did you have a good solid essay format? Did you capitalize and punctuate and spell everything correctly? And then the rest of it's going to have to do with, do you develop the ideas? Do you extend the ideas? And do you use actual terminology, right? Do you actually talk about these connections? Do you connect World War I with global trade? Right? I mean, are you connecting, women wanting suffrage with World War I, or with education or reform movements or anything like that? So there's lots of different ways you could have made connections. And so typically, if you are a little bit weak in the development of your ideas, your connection score would have been a little bit lower as well. And I tried not to give you a double whammy there. I tried to kind of differentiate some, but you can look at the comments and see for yourself. My 4B people, it'll probably be sometime in the morning before I get yours finished. But you can obviously listen to this and kind of look and see where you're at. So just kind of be watching your essay and be looking for, me to finish grading it so that you can reply. 2A and 4A, yours are already done, so you can get started on your revisions whenever you're ready. And I think that's pretty much it. And so I hope you are studying for your midterm tomorrow. And don't forget to get this done. If it's not done by Friday, deal's off the table. Okay. All right. We'll see you later, either tomorrow or Thursday.